This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
Estelle suggested that I point out that all of the pamphlets that are on the table out front are free. There's one book which is not free. It's the latest book which I published on the United Nations. And I'm reminded of a remark by David Hume after the first year of publication of his famous treatise on human understanding. The publisher contacted him and said, "Dear Dr. Hume, we published 1,000 copies of your book. We still have 990 left. What should we do with them?" And Hume said, "Well, I got to thinking, and I bought the 10 that were actually sold, and I don't remember that I gave them to anybody who was likely to have read them. So I said, send them to me." And I then entered in my diary, "I now have over 1,000 books in my library, most of which I wrote myself." I must say so far that the book on the UN has fallen stillborn from the press. At any rate, it's there and it's over with. As a preface, I want to call to our attention that in every culture there are a few adjectives which we reserve for very special occasions. The occasions are when we want to talk about something which we consider to be of supreme value, of supreme worth. And the two that I want to mention of the many that there are the word good and the word just. And that will include all synonyms and antonyms of them both. We've been rather loose in the use of those terms. It's not unsurprising to talk about a good beer, not surprising to talk about a good car, a good cigar, but obviously that's not what the word was intended for. What it was intended for and misused was when Studs Terkel, who ran a radio station, you recall, spoke of World War II as the good war. Now that is obvious oxymoron, and I don't know what was in Terkel's head when he said that. When you consider, and surely Terkel knew this as well as I did, that in war, and particularly in World War II, 45% of the casualties are civilians. And it's pretty hard to say, that's good killing, which is what you do in war. And that 60 million people were killed in World War II, and it's pretty hard to say, very good killing. And when 45% of those were civilians, 27 million people, it meant good is simply not an appropriate word. Because when Augustine, and we'll deal with him later, created the so-called theory of the just war, he said it has to be just in two senses. One, it has to have a just reason, and second, it has to be waged justly. It just happens to be the case that reasons are no longer given when nations wage war. Nations just go to war. We haven't given a reason for a war since the end of World War II. We just went there. We may have given some phony reasons, but we certainly didn't trouble ourselves with giving what we might call a just reason. But there's no question but what President Roosevelt thought World War II was going to be a just war. And President Truman, who succeeded him, thought that the war in Korea was a just war. And President Johnson and, if I can remember everybody, President Kennedy and President Nixon thought that the Vietnam War was just. And that word was used. What I want to talk about this evening, however, is how we came to be using words like good and just so indiscriminately. For it's the only one of the 10 commandments for which we've done this peculiar thing. There's no great dialogue about just rape, about just lying, just stealing, just coveting. Though there's no question of what there's a lot of raping, stealing, and coveting going on, but nobody expects a merit badge for it. That is, nobody says good, or nobody says just. It's the only one. I'm not sure whether one's religion has much effect on how one behaves to begin with, but I thought I'd point out what the religious persuasion was of those who declared the war and those who built the bomb. The war was declared and ratified by 2 Episcopalians, President Roosevelt and Secretary of State James Burns, 1 Baptist, President Truman, 1 Presbyterian, Secretary of War Stimson, and 1 who claimed no religion at all, General Groves. And who built the bomb? Now, obviously leaving some names out, but it is interesting to note that there were 2 Presbyterians, Carl and his brother Russell Compton, 2 Jews, Leo Szilard and James Frank, 1 Hindu, J. Robert Oppenheimer, 1 Roman Catholic, Enrico Fermi, 1 atheist, Glenn Seaborg, and 1 Unitarian, Vannevar Bush. At least half the scientists said the bomb should be dropped in some isolated spot, invite everybody to see how bad it is, and that's all we need to do, is to show how terrible it is. And they submitted, Frank, F-R-A-N-C-K, was the chair of that committee, submitted it to President Truman and the rest, and they said, no, we're going to drop them. In fact, Russell Compton said in his memoirs later, at no time when we were building the bomb did it ever occur to us that we wouldn't use them. Sure, we're going to use them. The question was where we're going to use them. Well, while a large number of the scientists thought they should be used in this other way, the decision made by Truman and Burns and Henry Stimson and Groves was go ahead. Even after Air Force General, doesn't matter what his name is, Spates, called Truman up on the phone and said, did you know that there are over 5,000 prisoners of war in Hiroshima, some of them Americans, the rest are Koreans? And Truman consulted his committee, who said that doesn't make any difference. The same was the case in Nagasaki. There were thousands of prisoners of war, including Americans. That didn't stop them from dropping the bomb. Now, I wanted to go back in religious history to see how it happened that you can get a committee, all of whom, with one exception, the general, interestingly enough, who said he wasn't interested in religion at all of whom had some religious association, but who didn't seem to balk at the idea of dropping 2 bombs on civilian centers. In fact, the 3 instructions that Truman gave to the military was, I want them dropped as soon as possible. I want them dropped where they'll kill the largest number of civilians we can do. And third, I want them dropped without warning. I went back to the Bible, figuratively speaking. I haven't gone back to it for a long time. But I do have a theological degree. And I recall that Jehovah in the first 5 books of the Old Testament was a warlike God. He killed people right and left. He wasn't bothered in the least. Indeed, when Moses and Aaron mentioned to Jehovah, incidentally, there are people already living in the promised land. What will we do? And Jehovah says, kill them all and move in. And that was the way things operated. There was no pacifism, no concern about weapons of mass destruction or whatever. That was the first 5 books. And then as you know, the Old Testament's longer than that, and we get some prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Micah. And at least one of them suggested it's time to change our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks. I don't know who he thought his audience was. At this time, the Jews had no army. They didn't even have a country. You remember they were in the so-called Babylonian exile all those hundreds of years. There wasn't any temple. In fact, most Jews had never heard of a temple. One of the problems when they came back, which is recorded in the Old Testament, was getting anybody interested in rebuilding a temple. But they finally got it rebuilt. There was a brief moment of military action on the part of the Jews, a group called the Maccabees, 1st and 2nd century before the current era. But that's all. In the first 3 centuries of the current era, there weren't any Jews or Christians in the Roman army. The Romans didn't want them. They made poor soldiers. In the first place, they're always having holidays and celebration days, and that sort of thing. You know, you couldn't do it after sunset and before sunrise, and sort of thing. But that was the mood up until the 4th century. Famous church fathers, the word father is an expression used for those first writers who came after the writers of the New Testament. And 2 of the fathers, Origen of Alexandria, and there was an Origen in Rome, and they both said no Christian should be in the army. And Tertullian, who was a bishop in Carthage, said when Jesus unbelted Peter, he unbelted every soldier. And if any soldier in the Roman army gets converted to Christianity, he better get out. And that was the mood until shortly after 300 current era, when Constantine got converted, the worst conversion that ever occurred. Would that he had never gotten converted. For Constantine got converted to Christianity and then noted that Christians wouldn't be soldiers. And as the head of state, he determined that everybody in the Roman Empire better give obeisance to Christianity, but now he's not going to have anybody in the army. St. Augustine came to the rescue, if that's the proper word. 354 he was born, lived into the middle of the 400s. St. Augustine came up with what is called just war theory. And the point of just war theory is to explain to Christians in some tortured way that what we've told you should never do, you now may occasionally do. That it's under some circumstances it's all right to kill. And as I mentioned earlier, nobody rose to do that for the rest of the commandments. I was reminded of the story when Moses came down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments. You remember, beginning with one God and worshiping his son, and all his followers are dancing around the golden calf. He didn't even get the first edition published before people had broken the very first one. There is a theory, which some biblical scholars hold, that the 10 Commandments were never intended to be applied except during the 40 years of the wandering of the Jews in the wilderness looking for the Promised Land. And by the time they got in the Promised Land, none of them applied. At least none of them applied to the strangers. That is, you didn't bear false witness to fellow Jews, you didn't covet, and all of the rest, but it was open field as far as the rest of the people were concerned. And if one looks at history, that more or less seems to be the case, particularly in the case of war. Now, Augustine had some imagination. In theological school, he was the favorite person whose biography I cherished, the Confessions of Augustine. He said, if 2 conditions can be met, you can do what you're previously been forbidden from doing. And the first is if you have a just cause. Now, he didn't use much imagination in saying, for example, this or that. And I never thought he had any very well thought out ones. One was, it's just if you come to the rescue of a friend who has been invaded. Well, I can think of some friends to whom we ought not to come to the rescue, even if they've been invaded. But anyway, that was one. The second one, which seemed a great sense, if you are invaded, then of course you can reply back, that is, you can war back. Nobody thought that was too bad. Third, if you don't have enough property and need some more, it's okay to go to war to get some more. Well, that got on a little more slippery ground. But the question was, who decides that the cause was just enough? Well, the Roman Catholics were saved, but not in Augustine's day, because you didn't have any popes until the 8th century. But the Catholics were saved because they had a pope. Before that, they had bishops, and the bishop would tell them. And when the popes came around, then the popes would tell them. The difficulty was that the bishops all didn't see eye to eye, because bishops would go to war against each other. And raised question as to the authority of church leaders to answer this question. With the development of nationalism, it was assumed that each country would appoint somebody, the president, the queen, the king, in the case of the U.S., the Senate, to decide the cause is, and I'm not sure whether just is a word that was ever used, but it's worth it to go to war. But that doesn't really answer the serious question, namely, who really knows whether you have a cause for which all the killing that war entails is justified? Who really knows? When the UN came on the scene, happy day in 1945, but World War I is all over with now. But when the UN came in, they said the Security Council, the 15 members, will decide if the UN authorizes a war. Now, since 1945, the U.S. has invaded militarily 70 times in 70 nations, sometime the same nation more than once. And in no instance, save one, did the Security Council say, that's okay. Security Council did not give approval for 69 of the U.S. invasions. The one it gave approval for was the war in the Congo. And the UN army was sent and roundly defeated. And they've never tried it again. The other wars, like Vietnam and Korea and so on, had no UN support. Those were just American ones. Because each nation assumes that it is, an authority in its own right, and no nation has a right to tell another nation that you didn't have a good cause, it has been assumed and practiced since about the beginning of the 19th century, early 1800s, for nations not to bother to declare war, just go. And declarations are few and far between. One disadvantage is if you declare war, then they'll declare war back. Whereas if you just do it, they may never get around to declaring war. And that turns out to have a great advantage. Because when, in the middle of the 19th century, the first meetings which invented and created the Red Cross and established the Geneva Accords, the Geneva meetings and subsequent meetings said, if war is being waged, here are certain rules you should follow. But if you never declared war, there's never any occasion to the rules. And that is more or less what George Bush does. He claims it's something else. It's not war. And hence, the Geneva Conventions of 1949 in 1976 are not applicable. So St. Augustine didn't do us much good saying, if the cause is just, because nobody knows what a just cause is, and nobody is willing to admit there is an agency whom they'd be willing to believe. But the other half was a good suggestion, if I may use the word good. It was at least logically a good suggestion, and that is, there are certain rules for waging the war. So there are rules for authorized going to war, and there are rules for how you're going to wage it. And the one word that stands out in the number of suggestions that Augustine makes is the word proportionality. You have to wage the war proportionally. Now, that's a pretty slippery term, and I doubt whether most soldiers have ever thought about proportionality. The military manual doesn't talk about it. But Augustine said you got to be proportional. That is, you shouldn't cause more damage in the war than would have been caused if you hadn't gone to war. Now, it's pretty hard to calculate what would have happened if you didn't go to war. And so anybody's guess is as good as any other. But you do know what's going to happen if you do go to war. Though most nations didn't do much better than George Bush did when he declared mission accomplished way back there when really nothing had been accomplished at all. Most nations assume when they enter war they're going to win. And you know very well that half the nations are mistaken because they all don't win. There's only one side, however many are on that side. But the notion of proportionality, and it's an important one because it has enabled us to have the belief in war crimes. And it enabled us in 1945-46 to conduct the war crimes trials in Nuremberg against the Germans, 24 of them, and against the Japanese in Tokyo, about 24 of them. For war crimes, well, you can't have a war crime unless there's a rule that there's something you shouldn't be doing. And where did you get the rule? And what is it you're not supposed to be doing? Well, in 1864, Henri, Henri Dunant, a Swiss merchant, visiting the field of battle, saw all these wounded people around, nobody taking care of them. He rallied the neighbors around and said, we got to do something for these poor folk. He appointed the committee. Next thing you know, in 1864, the first Geneva Convention, the Swiss government sponsored it, was held, and about 15 nations attended. About 30 of them were invited, about 15 attended. We didn't attend, but we were invited. And at that time, it was established many, many pages long, the care and feeding of prisoners of war. You may not wage a war where you won't take prisoners. You've got to take prisoners, you've got to feed them, clothe them, house them, as well as you do your own soldiers in the field. And you got to pay them salaries if you put them to work. So that at the end of the war, when they go home, they've got some money. Sound like a good idea. And the Red Cross was established, the International Red Cross. In 1968, they met again and said, we want to do the same for war at sea. And the rule is, if you sink the enemy ship, you've got to rescue all their soldiers from the ocean. You are not allowed to let them drown. You must pick them up, put them aboard your ship. When they're aboard, your ship is then called a Red Cross ship, and nobody should bomb it. You take them to the nearest port and leave the wounded ones off. U.S. was invited, didn't attend that one either, and when the occasion came, didn't approve it either. In 1874, a group met in St. Petersburg, Russia, and said, we've got a couple of weapons we think should be forbidden. And among the weapons are explosive bullets. I forget the number of grams. If it's bigger than a certain number of grams, it could be an explosive because then it's a hand grenade. If it's smaller than that, you could fire from a rifle, that should be forbidden. No explosive bullets. And no noxious gases or chemicals. And no bacteriologicals. Way back then, 1874. We didn't sign that one either. It was considered so important that U Thant in 1969, who was at that time Secretary General of the UN, urged the nations who had not signed the St. Petersburg, and there was another one later in Brussels, urged them to sign it, that they would not use explosive bullets or that they would not use bacteriologicals and so on. We didn't sign that either. So we're not off to a good start, and there weren't very many nations that went to the meeting to begin with. But then there were meetings at The Hague called by the Russian Tsar, one in 1899, one in 1907. And more nations attended that, and we attended those meetings. The aim of the Hague meetings was to reduce the havoc of war, that ultimately disarmament, but at least reduce the weapons, and clearly forbid the new and even more lethal weapons. An odd thing, maybe not so odd, happened. The only delegates the U.S. sent in 1899 and 1907 were military men. Military men were the ones who voted on whether weapons should be banned or allowed. When it came to voting on the really keynote one, which said no bacteriologicals, no noxious gases or chemicals, the only negative vote was Captain Mahan from the U.S. And our present military manual still says we're not a member of any, whatever you want to call it, rule or whatnot, which says you can't use bacteriologicals, noxious, and so on. So it was a tough problem here for those who thought you could wage a war justly if you just picked the right kind of weapons. But it turned out that we lived in a country which didn't seem to be interested in limiting the number of weapons. Not just weapons of mass destruction, all of which we own. Indeed, the list of nations which own all the kinds of weapons of mass destruction, beginning with atomic and so on, we're among the few who have all of them, and have all of them in ample amounts. So what would poor St. Augustine say if he comes around here in 2006 or 2007 to see whether we're waging the war proportionally? What do Roman Catholic philosophers say? What do Roman Catholic theologians say? What does the Pope say about this second requirement of St. Augustine, that the war has to be waged proportionally? Some years ago, I had occasion, while I was in Hawaii, to attend a week's meetings over at the military base on Oahu, on the windward side of Oahu, the other side from Honolulu, led by a man who was going to rewrite the military manual, tidy it up, so that at least it shows some interest, some inclination to say, we draw the line someplace. And I met a week with them, and I promised that I wasn't going to rattle their cage, and this I sat and listened, which was not all that easy, because the manual, which still hasn't come out, this would have been in 75, the revised manual hasn't appeared yet, and the one we're using is still the 1974 version. And I had written down what it says in each of these. Let me just read, if I can read them. What it says in the Law of Land Warfare, which is the U.S. Army Manual. Interestingly, the Navy and the Air Force don't have a manual like this. They have a manual, but not like this. And that's because it's harder for the Air Force and the Navy to be discriminate. Once you start dropping bombs from 40,000 feet, you can't claim, oh, it was a smart bomb I dropped. You may or may not remember that in World War II, a bomb was considered precise if it was within 50 miles of the target. In fact, what seemed to be the case was the bomb dropped and then they drew a circle around it and said, see, right on target. At any rate, in the one we currently used, Article 34 says, the use of anti-personnel landmines is not prohibited. Not prohibited. The General Assembly of the UN said they are prohibited, but as we all know, the General Assembly makes just recommendations. Or the US, who played a major role in setting it up, saw to it that there was no danger that any declaration of the General Assembly might be interpreted as international law. In fact, there was quite a movement within the UN on the part of lawyers who weren't happy with this and wanted to argue that surely if 180 of the 191 nations voted for something, that's as close to international law as you could get. But the pressure was, nope, remember we said at the start, we being the US, I don't know how China, Britain, France, and Russia voted on that, but I know how we voted. We don't take declarations of the United Nations that seriously. So it still says in the manual, even though the UN voted overwhelmingly, the General Assembly, to ban anti-personnel landmines, particularly to the kind that we manufacture. I don't know whether this was in the newspapers or not, but there's quite a business in manufacturing weapons, as you well know, and the military never saw a weapon it didn't like unless it was inefficient. Indeed, the only banned weapon in the current manual is lances with barbed tips. Now, I doubt there's much of a market of anybody trying to sell lances with barbed tips, but that happened to be in the 1863 manual, which was the first military manual we wrote. We manufactured explosives, big bomb, it explodes, and they're little bomblets. And they remain lethal. They're lying on the ground. They're like landmines. And what do you know? They come in three shapes. Coca-Cola cans, white baseballs, and butterflies. Just the sort of thing that children would want to pick up. Now, in the 1914 military manual, it said if you're going to use landmines like that, number one, they have to self-destruct after a finite amount of time so that when the war is over, they don't remain dangerous. And you have to map them so when the war is over, you can tell the people of whatever country that you laid the lines exactly wherever mine is. But as soon as airplanes came around, we dropped them from the air and nobody knew where they were. And that was conveniently forgotten. So at any rate, the use of anti-personnel landmines is not prohibited. Article 35 says the use of atomic weapons does not violate any international law. Well, that's because we don't believe in international law. But there are international laws. There are professors of international law. Indeed, I consulted the 2-volume international law. Great big thick thing, full of international laws. Not only is it printed in all of these books that this is a weapon so indiscriminate that it would be violated by any sense of proportionality, but the World Court of the UN was asked, would you pass judgment on this? Now, the World Court wondered whether they're qualified to pass judgment that atomic bombs should be banned. And there were two views on this. One was that's out of their field of competence, and the other was it's within their field of competence. Well, the World Court finally voted, very narrowly by one vote, that the use of atomic bombs was prohibited. But if you don't believe in the World Court, as the US hasn't all these years, it doesn't make any difference. You may recall when we were called into the World Court by Nicaragua to atone for the land mines, water mines that were floating around there causing a hazard. And they brought us to court, and the World Court found us guilty and fined the U.S. some multi-million-dollar sum. And President Reagan said the U.S. is above the court. Well, so much for proportionality, so much for being able to take care of St. Augustine's second requirement. Article 36 in our current manual says the use of napalm is not prohibited. Now, one of the expressions that was in the Brussels Congress of the mid-1870s and in both of the Hague Congresses was, you shouldn't use a weapon which causes unnecessary suffering. Now, anyone in medicine knows it's pretty hard to measure suffering. You know, the doctor asked me on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad does it hurt, that sort of thing. But it was required, according to the Hague, that no weapon which caused unnecessary suffering or superfluous injury should be allowed. Well, here you've got the problem, who's the judge? Who's the judge? Well, if the U.S. says atomic bombs are not causing unnecessary or superfluous injury, I guess one could hardly worry about napalm. I found it troubling, being a professor, that napalm was invented by a college professor at Harvard, a chemistry professor. The request had been sent out by, by the Pentagon. Give us a thing which you can't wipe off. Give it something for which you can't spray to alleviate it. And he tried this out, and back at the bleachers in the football field at Harvard University, and it's called napalm. Well, surely, if there is such a thing as proportionality, napalm is disproportional. They didn't stop President Bush Sr. from using it against the retreating troops in 1991, in January, and it didn't stop us at the present time for carrying and using napalm in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Article 38 says, the United States is not a party to any treaty now in force that prohibits or restricts, am I doing that? That limits or restricts the use in warfare of toxic or non-toxic gases, incendiary materials, or bacteriological warfare. Now, St. Augustine is pretty irrelevant. And hence the notion of just war, depending on St. Augustine's notion that there are limits and we believe in those limits, St. Augustine seems to be irrelevant, seems to be trivial. It would be strange if St. Augustine had been right back in the 4th century when he said, if Christians slay, they'll do it with more compassion. And that's what he was banking on. Now, I've never been to boot camp, but I've read a lot about boot camp, and I don't remember there being any section during boot camp in which the chaplain reminds them, remember, you slay with compassion. That is, there are some limits. That Christians don't kill the way Muslims do, or the way atheists do, or something of that sort, which is an idle dream. One more thing I want to say, and then I want to open it up for questions. Most people assume that if they have an ethical system, it should be able to handle every question. I used to think that. I don't believe that anymore. But what I do believe, that it does handle every situation, but not the way we wanted it. An ethical system is supposed to be universal. And if it's wrong for us, it's wrong for everybody. If it's right for us, it's right for everybody. There are situations, and having been a conscientious objector in World War II and been on the stump for these many years since, somebody's always asked me a question, what would you do if Canada invaded the U.S.? Would you join the Army? And the answer is no, I wouldn't join the Army. Do you think anybody should join the Army? Well, I'm not the authority on what other people should do, but I wouldn't join the Army. But what if Canada really is mean and nasty about it? And they start doing terrible things to the northern Idaho and Washington. And I said, if it comes bad enough to where the authorities that be think armed reprisals against them needs to be done, do it. But don't expect to be blessed. There's no reason why you need an ethical system which tells you you're okay in every tight spot. It just happens, as Niebuhr said in his book Moral Man in an Immoral Society, there are times when you behave immorally, and you must admit you're behaving immorally. Whatever your reasons are for doing it, don't expect a reward. Don't expect someone to say, oh, that was good, or that was just. Well, let me stop at that point. Enough of this. There must be some questions out of this morass of words. My conclusion is the just war justifies too much. If there is a question, make sure it's loud enough, and I'll repeat it in any event. Is there a mic?
We have a mic. If people have questions,
yeah.
I'm going to go get it and bring it around.
Raise your hand if you want the mic. Here's a person in the front row wants the mic.
Hi, Don. I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you. I have a question about the war rules. In 1874 and 1969, when it was proposed to have the war rules, where the explosive bullets could not be used or bacterial weapons could not be used, which countries actually initiated those war rules, and generally which countries agreed to those rules?
I didn't bring everything with me, but I can tell you how many nations were there and report that they voted in favor of the prohibition. I can find the blue page here. Not many nations. Okay, the first meeting in Geneva in 1863, which established the Red Cross, 16 nations went to the meeting, and over half of them supported it. That meant it passed. But it may have passed then with 9 nations out of the world said we should take our prisoners. In St. Petersburg in 1868, only 17 nations attended. We weren't there. I have a list at home. I don't have a list here. But at least half of them, more than half of them voted that was a good idea. At the first meeting at The Hague, 26 nations, 1899, 44 nations in 1907. We went to that, and most of the nations supported what was recommended. But does that make it law? Well, you got to believe in international law before it's law. But if you read international law books, indeed, if you read the U.S. Army manual, they quote the Hague and Geneva decisions as if they were international law. And they state in the footnote, we just don't happen to accept it. So you really can't have an international law if a nation can say they don't accept it. But I'm sorry I can't tell you which nations. But the big meeting in 1949, when the famous Geneva III, which forbids torture and all that sort of thing, there were 61 nations. But we didn't okay it. We weren't one. But enough nations okayed it. So that in textbooks of international law, they say it is an international law that, and spell it out. Parenthetically, when the war crimes trials were held in 1945, of course, you had a 1929 Geneva one, but nothing beyond that. When the war crime trials were held, the problem of the judges was, where are the laws that the Germans broke for which we now say they committed a crime? And they went back to 1863, to 1899, to 1907, blithely ignoring the fact that the U.S. didn't agree with any of them. American judges sat on the court. But they were very cagey. No German or Japanese was ever found guilty of using an improper weapon. No one in the Air Force was ever found guilty of dropping bombs on civilians. The only crime that the Germans were guilty of was what they did to the Jews, the Gypsies, and to a bunch of Poles. Did it set a precedent? And the answer is no, it didn't set a precedent as a result, which gives us any comfort that we now are closer to international laws, with regard to weapons. Excuse me, there was a question in the back. I don't know if I answered that.
I'll do some research.
Google it.
So you know where I stand. I was against the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and I'm against the war in Iraq. The only problem I have with this discussion is not just tonight, but I certainly did not want to live under Nazi rule, and I certainly did not want to live under the rule of the Imperial Army of Japan. I don't know how as I look at it, how we could have escaped that conflict in World War II. Also, I really didn't want the British people to be living under the Nazis. I didn't want the French to be, there were lots of terrible things there. I don't know how to put that together, and that's where that good war thing comes from. I know there's no such thing as a good war. It's ridiculous. But that's where it came from. That was supposed to be because we had to do that one.
Right.
That's my question. What do you do about something like I was 6 years old when the war was over, and all these guys came home, and I'll tell you, they were my heroes. And when I finally got out of college, I was working for all these guys. They were in middle management. Everybody was a World War II veteran, the men. And, I really appreciated them for what they did. How do you reconcile this? What would be the alternative? I tell you right now, from what I know about the Japanese army and what I know about the Nazis, I don't want to live under that regime.
Two things, both of which I referred to. Let me mention again what I said at the conclusion. Nobody is going to have a system of ethics which will cover him in every situation so that he will be praised for what he's doing. That is, we live in a world in which there are some things we feel we have to do for which we deserve no praise. I accept that. I don't expect every good deed that I think I'm doing to be meritorious. But it's also the case that one has to reflect on what it cost. And it's hard to measure this. 60 million people were killed in World War II. That's a pretty big pile. And if it was good to go to war, it was good to kill the 60 million. And it was good to kill the 27 million civilian men, women, and children. And I find that hard to say. What I would have done if I were in England, who can say I'm not in England, there were English conscientious objectors. Nobody wanted to live under Nazism. Not even many of the Germans wanted to live under it. Any question about that? But if we live in a world in which our last resort, not our first resort, is to take up arms, then that's the kind of world we live in. And we're going to have to be evil people in order to solve our problem. But one thing that made me pleased when the UN was established was you didn't need to have that as a resort if you took the UN seriously. And the US, as one of the founders, took it seriously at the beginning, and we haven't taken it seriously since. There isn't a war we fought, Korea, Vietnam, First Gulf War, Second Gulf War, that wouldn't have been easily resolved in negotiation. Not a one. I'm more conversant off the cuff here. Actually, I'm not able to read my notes anyhow, so I've just been off the cuff. But sure.
I agree with you completely on what you just said. That still doesn't resolve our problem with these two countries. And what were we going to do? What would we do?
Well,
Would we just lay down and let them march over us? What would we do?
no. Even in India, they didn't lie down, let them walk over them. Let me take a contemporary situation, which I think I could get some pacifist support for. Somebody should go into Darfur. Since the UN is denied access, and since the powers with the veto don't exert themselves enough, some kind of force should be sent to the Sudan. And if the only way to handle the Janjaweed and so on is with military force, then so be it. But don't expect to get a medal for it. We live in a world in which some bad things need to be done. And rather than sacrifice, the scope of one's moral principles, it's better to admit that one is behaving immorally.
Thank you. I really have appreciated hearing you tonight, and I'd just like to ask if we should think about the in terms of World War II, the so-called just war, how it is that the United States and Britain, our principal ally, was responsible for the killing of so many of those civilians by devastating cities, leaving out even the atomic bombs, just the fire bombing and conventional bombing of cities was so horrendous. If it seems to me that we just need to raise the public consciousness that we all have a role in that.
Yeah, the number of people killed by aerial bombing, which is so indiscriminate, firebombing of Tokyo, of Dresden, you go down the list, it didn't solve anything. I mean, just killing civilians. It's like the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The military theory is if you kill enough civilians, the other guys will give in. And they don't shoot back at you. It's much safer to bomb civilians than soldiers. Yes? Give him the mic.
This term, nations wage war, is a little bit confusing to me. For example, right now we have a situation where the people of this nation, almost 70%, want to stop this war, but it continues. So do you differentiate between nations and another layer of, or layers of the nation that wage war, or create wars, or get people involved in wars?
Well, obviously, nobody in any nation can really speak for the nation. Bush doesn't speak for the nation. His cabinet doesn't speak for the nation, it just speaks for the cabinet. The Senate doesn't speak for the nation. It just does what Senate is supposed to do. And one has to distinguish, to be sure. I've always had trouble with the pledge allegiance to the flag. I never pledge allegiance to the flag. If they do that at a meeting, I wait outside until they've finished with it. And with a prayer, too, incidentally. And then I come in. Because if you're pledging allegiance nowadays, you're pledging allegiance to what Bush is doing. There's no amorphous America to which you're pledging allegiance. You're pledging allegiance to the power in government which is prevailing.
I was listening to an interview, or it was a transcript of an interview with a Tua from Taos, New Mexico, who was speaking about war, and he was talking about Vietnam, and he was talking about, I think this was right around the time going into Iraq, that this country deserves the kick in the ass. And if things came onto our soil, it would be just, after having been involved in all these things. Can you talk a little bit about that? I kind of felt a strong sense of resonance with what he was saying. I get frightened, and then I say to myself, what makes me any better than the guy we're bombing now, or who has been bombed in the past?
Niebuhr was no comfort to me, but he gave me some insight that we live in a society in which we're contaminated and we can't escape it. When I started out in the 30s, I read Quaker literature, voluntary poverty and all of this sort of thing, so you wouldn't have to be involved in the money business, and you wouldn't be contaminated by stocks and that sort of thing. Can't do that. We live in a society in which we're all stained by what's going on. And one might say there are degrees of being stained. One protests for one can protest, and you can be a woman in black, and that at least tells where you stand, even if it doesn't change the situation at all. But you want more than that. Right? Say it again. Pardon? Oh, I thought there was going to be a break, and you were going to hold up signs saying 10 minutes before. I didn't see them. Let's have a break. I'm getting tired, frankly, and there's only so much can be said about the subject. But if there are questions, I certainly think they should.
I've got the mic.
Here's the mic. You ask it if you got the mic.
I will. Helen Caldecott writes that that from a UN report that when 30% of a governmental parliament or legislative body is women, then they start voting differently than when there's under 30%. And when it's under 30%, they go along with kind of the traditional male model of leadership. But when there's 30%, it shifts and they start voting for more human needs, milk for babies. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that, how you envision how things might change as women become more active. Because I guess the U.S. percentage right now is only about 15%. Arab states have about 9%. The Scandinavian countries are closer to 40, I think. So
you all heard the question. I trust women about as much as I trust men. And I'm not sure I'd feel any better if there were more women in the military. I don't want anybody in the military. I remember I was asked years ago, do you think women should be in the military? And I said, I don't think men should be in the military. But there's certainly a lot of unused talent out there if we don't have at least as many women as there are men holding public office, provided they don't be like Margaret Thatcher. But sure, I just think it's terrible. That I vote for Nancy Pelosi.
yeah, me too. I just want to say one other thing. I was speaking with a woman in Uganda because I think part of their new law is that they have to have a certain percentage of women. And I asked her what if she thought it was making a difference, and she and this other man I was talking to, they both said, well, there certainly has been less corruption allegations about the women than there had traditionally been about the men. So,
Yeah. I'm willing to believe that. I'm willing to believe almost anything.
I really enjoyed listening to you. I think when I think of women, I think of us, our responsibility as mothers to our sons. And why is it in a military which is purely voluntary, why haven't we taught our sons better to not go, to not fight? Why, so does it really matter if there's women in the legislature or president? If we can't teach our children that war is just wrong, just like we would teach our sons, don't pull the legs off of that frog. It's all basically the same thing.
Right.
And so, sometimes I get really angry with women that I saw a lady today, she was at Weimar, and she was buying her son this little plastic gun, and when are we going to take the responsibility for being better parents to our children?
There was one good thing I could have said about the U.S., which I was reminded by Estelle, I think, that the first military manual which was ever written in the Western world with an attempt to set limits was written by the U.S. in 1863 under Abraham Lincoln at his request, and written by a college professor from Columbia. Last name was Lieber, I forget his first name now. And it was such a smashing success that Germany, France, England, Italy copied it word for word, changing only the proper name of the country. It was an astounding thing. And it emphasized what the first Geneva Conference emphasized, namely, you've got to take prisoners. You don't fight a war of no quarter. You've got to take prisoners. And you've got to take care of them. And that's why this famous or infamous war crimes trial at Andersonville, Georgia, was carried out on the basis of that manual. That was the prisoner of war camp in the South, in Georgia. Out of 35,000 prisoners, something like 25,000 starved to death or died of disease. And a war crimes trial was held, and the poor man who turned out to be innocent was hanged. He happened to be the head of the camp. But he was in Switzerland when the camp was set up. He didn't pick the place in the swamp, and he was denied all the material that he needed, medical and so on. It's all written up in a government document about that thick, 1,000 pages long, which I happened to run across when I was working the whole trial. And it showed that most people thought Henry Wirtz, W-I-R-Z, was perfectly innocent of it. It was a terrible camp, but it wasn't his fault. But they charged Robert E. Lee. They were going to hang Lee for it. But all of those guys got off, and they just picked Henry Wirtz. But you've been very patient. Yes? One more.
Yes, Don, the UN, such a wonderful concept that we designed and supported in 1945. And I'm sure it's been terribly discouraging to you and to many of us, the lack of respect that the United States has shown to it.
Yeah.
Now, my question is, what would you do, or what would you propose be done to get the United States and the UN in harmony?
Well, without being too partisan, you better vote Democrat, number one. Not that Clinton was a paragon of virtue. He, after all, signed NAFTA. Terrible thing to have done. But in any event, it's clear that if we get enough Democrats in Congress, we're going to get some good things done. The best ambassadors to the UN have all been under Democratic administration. The first one that we appointed, Edward Stettinius, a businessman. And he was smarter than everybody else. He and Eleanor Roosevelt saw to it that human rights and all the rest were brought in there. He thought the use of the veto was terrible and told the president that, and the president said, "Don't say that again or I'll bring you home." So under Democratic presidents, we had some pretty good ambassadors. Under Republican presidents, it's been a disaster, including the current one, who's just like the last one, only he's got better manners. Now, I don't know. We bear a great, we, living and dead kind of, for the fact that the UN is set up the way it's set up. But I'll take it as it is with all its, all its defects. And I regret that the power of the veto was ever in there. But I certainly applaud the General Assembly for the marvelous resolutions they've passed against the discrimination of women. 189 to 2. U.S. and, what was it? Some African country voted against it. Against abuse of children. 189 to 2. U.S. voted against it. Whoever's got the mic.
Yeah, I've got it now. When we talk about the 10 Commandments, we tend to talk in negative terms as things we should not do rather than things we should do. And in particular, and one positive that's common to many religions is in one way or another to say one should love one's neighbor as oneself. Right. The getting back to the Second World War, when it started, we sort of had no choice but to go to war, it seemed. But, and I'm not a historian, but many say that the seeds of the Second World War were planted at the end of the First World War, but the way Germany was divided.
Right. Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah, and Japan was deprived of oil in Indonesia, apparently later on, for various reasons. And because either seeking vengeance and winning the war, settling it, and trying to get even in some way or another, things happen that lead us almost without alteration directly towards another war. And in the Middle East, there was the way that was carved up in the past, which laid the groundwork for a lot of things, the problems we have there now. What would you suggest we can do of a positive nature to avoid getting into war situations?
There's so many things that need to be done that we really can't do. But the first thing that needs to be done is to get rid of the economic system we've got. We've got an economic system which undermines the political system, which destroys democracy. Capitalism goes with fascism, doesn't go with democracy. The last couple of wars we've been in are because of greed. It had nothing to do with Versailles sorts of things. I mean, the reason why we didn't go in and help the poor people in Darfur is there wasn't any oil in Darfur, or we'd have been there. And that's a matter of, on the positive side, of remembering that we're supposed to be good Samaritans. And that's not one of the 10 Commandments, but it certainly ought to be at the head of the list. We ought to be good Samaritans. Let's decide that we've worn this one out here. Thank you for your attendance.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax deductible. This recording is not copyrighted and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.